Hello, this is Jeremy Terrell from UNC Wilmington, and now we're going to be looking at charting industries and salary data. So this is going to be predicated on the form we already looked at. Now that we have some information from our program graduates about what industries they've entered and the salaries they're receiving, we can now chart that visually for particular purposes. This is going to be pulled from the form we've already set up. So if you haven't watched that tutorial, you might want to do that. But basically, we're taking data that's already in a Google Sheet linked to a form and charting that. Internally, we can use this to shape our program, right? If we know where people are going in terms of industries, that may give us insight into ways we could modify our program, either to lean into that trend or perhaps try and turn things a different direction. Also information about responding to institutional queries. So when I say internally, I of course mean the institution as well. They may be interested in what our program graduates are doing occupationally and the kind of salaries that they are encountering. Externally, of course, this can be used and is probably most effectively used for recruitment purposes. A lot of us are in English departments. I know I am, and that for lots of reasons is often seen as a non-vocational major. You know, doesn't directly tie to a vocation. And of course, that's not accurate, or at least that image is rather complex. That's a hard argument to make, but when you have data that you can visualize, it's a much more effective argument. We can demonstrate, okay, well, this is what people are doing who have graduated from our program, and these are the salaries they're receiving. Okay, so in terms of formats or products we're going to be putting here, we can make print products, of course, for print publication or email circulation or whatever. Ultimately, when I say print, I'm just talking about a static image of some sort. Of course, resolution comes into play if we're going to be using these on screen or in actual print or even other formats. The good news is that the information we're going to be working with can be easily exported to something like Microsoft Excel or another desktop spreadsheet program. And those tools have much better print capabilities than something like Google Sheets. Google Sheets is really, you know, it's for online interaction. So when it exports images, they're in screen resolution, essentially. If we move the data, once we've cleaned it and formatted it, into Microsoft Excel and then set up a chart there, its printing capabilities, you know, it can output and does in much higher resolutions. Electronically, we can output to different kinds of embeddable interactive visualizations, things that, you know, respond to a mouse over and that kind of thing. But we do have some flexibility with this that we didn't perhaps have with the incoming map of students, because that was largely limited to electronic distribution, or else the print quality would suffer. As I mentioned, the tools we're going to be using are Google Sheets. That's linked to our form. There's a lot you can do there. If you ultimately want to work in print, it's probably best just to export the data to CSV or Excel format and then create the charts there, because the printing capabilities are much more high resolution. All right, so that's the gist of that. Let's take a look at what we're doing. So this is the response form for the response sheet for the form that we set up in a previous tutorial. You can see we've got our responses here. We've got 18, and this again is test data. Curiously, they all have the same email address, and it appears to be fraudulent. Different locations. We have some folks who are working, some folks who are going on to graduate education, some folks who didn't reply. Of those folks who are working, we've got some different employers, some different industries, and some different salary ranges. Of those folks who are going into graduate education, we've got different institutions and different degrees. So for what we're going to be doing right now in terms of charting industry and salary data, you can see that for industries, we do want to include people who are furthering their education through graduate school. That's certainly one of the industries, if we even want to call it that. It's certainly one of the things we want to demonstrate. Salary data, however, doesn't really pertain, or at least our form isn't set up to collect it anyway. So we'll look at how to handle that. But let's just start with industry data. So this is all of our industry data. And notice that there are gaps. For those folks who are furthering their education, they don't get the industry question. So there's nothing there. The same is true for those who don't reply or who have no response for the question about if that person is working or furthering his or her education. So that's no big deal. We have these gaps. What we're going to do is, since these are our raw responses, and in theory at least, with each new response, it's going to add a new entry here, just right underneath. And that's, if we only send these out once a year or whatever. So I don't really want to do any kind of tinkering in this sheet. I can still use this workbook, but in this sheet, if there's going to be new data added, you don't want to start sorting and moving things because it could mess with your data collection. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new sheet, and I'm going to call it, let's just call it industry data. Okay. I'm actually going to move this to the left, so the raw responses are always going to be as far as we can to the right. This actually is a little bit in prep for some of our later tutorials where if you import this data directly, it's going to be looking only at the first sheet. For example, when we start doing some maps or some fusion tables later on, it's going to want to look at that first sheet. So we don't want the raw responses to be the first thing. Anywho, so here are our responses. Here's our industry data sheet. All we really need, we don't need names or locations or anything like that. All we really need are these responses under industry. I'm just going to copy those and put them here. And we just copied the values. We didn't move anything. We just copied the values directly. Now we're going to have to do some sorts and that kind of thing. But that's no big deal. I am going to add a header row really quickly. Called industry, and then count, because I want to count up how many folks are in these various industries. I'm also going to freeze that row. Whenever you do a header row, you should usually, well, I don't know if you usually, I tend to freeze that, because then of course that header row always stays visible. Anywho, so we want to go ahead and sort this data to collect things together for our counts. And our counts are going to be very similar to what we did with the incoming student geographical data. We're just going to do simple, not manual counts exactly, because manual count introduces the possibility for human error. But since we're dealing with not that much data, we're probably going to do the same sort of allowing the sheet to count cells for us. But our first step is the sort. So let's just do a select here. We do have a row. We're going by industry. Sure, we'll do alphabetical for now, although that's probably going to change because of how we want to present things. So there we go. Now we've got our count. Now, what we don't have here, though, however, is graduate education, right? So what do we do about that? There are a couple of ways to handle this. One would simply be to go and make your count here. Now, that is a manual count, and it's really only doable from here if it's a limited amount of data. So if there are other ways to handle this. Whoops, I want that. So let's back up a bit. Instead of just plopping down this, let's go ahead and cut that out. Let's actually plop out these three, or the data in these three columns. Let's make it so we can see it. Now, actually, we're not going to want this data at all. These are employers. We can get rid of that column. We'll just have to rename up here, count. And we'll do that in a second. But this will tell us what we need to input here. That is to say, this person who's furthering his or her education, we're going to want to go ahead and put graduate education. That's the catch-all I'm using for people who are doing something beyond their bachelor's. That language is actually contingent. Sometimes it's called postgraduate education, which is it's usually outside of this country. Anywho, but see, we wouldn't want that for people who have no response, right? So we really only want to check here and just paste that for folks who have this "I'm furthering my education." Okay, now we can actually get rid of this data, and there's a couple ways to do that. You could just delete the column outright, or you can actually just cut and paste this. We don't really need it anymore. Now when we do our sort, we've got our graduate education in here, which is good because it's looks like it's the largest. And we'll add count. So we can go ahead and just count these. Whoops. And as I said, lots of different ways to do this. We're probably going to use the same method we did for incoming students, mapping them geographically, which is to say simply selecting the cells for a particular category, and then it'll give us our count down here in the bottom right where it says count for. It's simply counting cells with data. Which means you don't want to make a mistake and go over because it'll count 5. If you're fastidious about this, or if you have a lot of data, you can always use the count A formula. I'm just going to type equals and then count, and it'll give me different options. I'm going to select count A, and then I can select these cells, and you really should hit your close parentheses, but it'll do that automatically for you. And then it's going to give you a count. Now, as I said, this is good for a lot of data. The one catch, though, is this value 4 here is not coded in. It's not an actual value. And that can get a little funny if you're going to be moving things around and doing different sorts. That's why I tend to just do the cell select. Make. Whoops. And I somehow messed it up. It's 1. Our count is 5. See, our count is 3. See, our count is 1, and then we can see our count is 2. Okay, so now again we're going to resort. Oops. Got ahead of row. This time we are going to go ahead and sort by count, because that will put all of our counts up here in order, and then it'll put all our duplicates underneath, and we can just get rid of them. We're actually going to go descending, so we have the most frequent, which is graduate education here up top. Yep. And now we can just get rid of this superfluous data because it's already been counted. We're not losing anything. So we've got our industries and their respective counts. Now, probably the best way to visualize this, I mean, that's the data right there. For this particular topic, industry data, since we're talking about a percentage ultimately, right now it's not set as a percentage, but that's what we want to see, right? Is what percentage of folks is going into these separate industries. So we probably want to use a pie chart, the chart, dedicated to percentages. Some people quail at that a little bit. And of course, since we have the data, you can do whatever you'd like. But really, we're talking about 100%. Pie chart's really, built for that. I'm just going to go ahead and select my categories and my count. It's already in order, and that's good because then it's going to show our pieces of pie in descending size. Just going to go up here to Insert Chart. It gives us some recommendations. We don't have to meddle with this. I'm just going to go to Chart here. Pie. I always use 2D. Some folks like this 3D. I don't, because then the foreshortening actually sort of messes up the visual. At this point, we're not doing a donut chart. And other than just having this hole in the middle, a donut chart can be useful if we're talking about two separate factors or variables. So in theory, we could do a donut chart that had something like percentage of folks going into different industries, and then the salaries they're obtaining. We're actually not going to be doing that in this tutorial. We're going to look briefly at using a stacked column chart for that. But that's something you could do. Essentially, the way that works is you have one variable in one ring, and then the other variable in the pie slice, as it were. That is an option. Certainly talk to me if you'd like to do something like that. We're just going to be using a simple 2D pie chart for this. Oh, and we'll look at that in a second. So we've got sort of a mock-up of what it looks like here. We do need to go to customize. One thing pops out, right? What is this purple? Well, it's government, and it doesn't have a percentage there. That's weird because it's 1. It's the same as print and electronic publishing, which does have a label. The only reason that's happening is the label is physically too large, and so it's getting cut off. See, the angle on this pie slice is different. We can actually change that. It's by scaling it down a point, and now they all fit. This is here under slice. So if we want to give our chart a title, we can. I usually don't, and I'll tell you why. Because if I'm going to be using this elsewhere, then I'll insert that title through a different program. If you don't want to mess with that, you can put it here. Something about percent of reported graduates in fields or whatever. I'm not going to use a title, but you can certainly put it there. Whoops. We've got our legend, and we can tinker with that if we'd like. I think it's fine as is, but you have the capacity to change its position and its font appearance. Arial, which is, of course, just a knockoff of Helvetica. I just can't use it, so I'm going to switch to Tahoma here. Yeah, we don't want to do maximize because it pushes these. You can do that. I'm not going to because it distorts other decisions we've made in terms of relationship to legend and that kind of thing. You can individually change the colors. These seem fine to me. So there's our basic pie chart. Now, if we're going to use this electronically, we're pretty much good to go. We can, as before, publish this just by clicking publish because it's smart enough to know that we're asking it to do just this visualization. Copy it, and here's our URL. This is what it looks like. And you can see when you mouse over, you get a little bit more information. Truth be told, it's not super useful because it's not presenting any new information except the actual numerical counts, which you may not even want presented. Like if you have a very small data set, you may not want to draw attention to the fact that it's 5 people who reported this. So you may not even want the interactive one. You can publish it as a static image as well. I'm going to leave it as interactive, but you can simply select image, and it's just a static image. However, if you're going to do that, you might as well just go here, save image, and get a screen resolution image of your display. It just downloaded it here to my desktop. There we go. Now, as I mentioned, if we want to actually print this, I'd really encourage you just to bring this into Excel. And there's a couple of ways to do this. If you go to File, Download As, Excel, it'll do the whole workbook. and it'll actually bring in an approximation of this chart, but you usually have to go in and kind of tinker with the chart anyway. So I'm not sure you really save any steps. I prefer usually just to download as a CSV, because that's only going to be the current sheet, not the whole workbook. And if you're going to have to make changes to the chart anyway, why not just go ahead and do it? So here's our data. So it's just the CSV, so it's just this one sheet. We can go ahead and recreate the chart here in Excel, which does have some capabilities that Google Sheets does not. It just has a lot more options that you can tinker with. As is the case with really all of Microsoft Office, it has a lot of functionality that you're probably just never going to use. So that can be a little disorienting, because, you know, anything that's superfluous is an issue. But it's relatively easy just to kind of do the same thing that we just did. We'd probably want to go in and add data labels. And you'll notice by default it has them as the counts. We actually want them as the percentage rather than the value, and you can see this change as you do it here. That black isn't going to show up great, so I'm going to go ahead and just change that to, well, not red, to white. And you'll notice it's actually rounding. We can change those data labels to look, whoops, not that one, to look like these, where it's going to the tenths. Too many things open here. It's rounding by default. We can change it. I'm not going to bother. Now, as I said, if you're the reason to bring it in here is for printing purposes. If I just select this and do my normal print, it'll give you a full page here that you can then export to PDF or to other formats even. I'd remove this border, of course. But that's going to get pumped out at print resolution. It's just a much higher resolution than you're going to get from saving. You can see this is the image that came directly from Google Sheets. So again, if you're going to be dealing with printing, I do recommend just go ahead and put your data in Excel here and then just recreate the chart there. Nah, what's the point? Okay, so that's our pie chart of industry data. We're now going to look at the salary data, and that's going to be just slightly different. We've got our raw responses here. We've got our salary here. Now, this is only going to include folks who are working, right? Unlike the industry, we're not going to be including education. And for right now, we're not even going to be including the industry. As I mentioned, we're briefly going to look at collating all this together and looking at salary ranges within industries. I don't always recommend putting that all together because the resulting visualization, although quite communicative, doesn't always serve recruitment purposes great because it's a little more complicated. If you're using this as a fact sheet to give to potential students at, you know, a major fair or something like that, you don't want them trying to, you know, struggling to decrypt a visualization. It's purely a rhetorical issue. If you're using it internally, it's probably a good choice because people will spend more time looking at a report that's breaking things down by sort of covariables. If we're talking recruitment, I recommend keeping salary data and industry data separate just because it's a lot more digestible at a glance. So for that, it's going to proceed pretty similarly, but there are going to be one or two wrinkles. So let's go ahead and make a new sheet here. I don't want to duplicate. I just want a new one. So I just click there. Again, I'm going to move it left. I'm going to rename this to salary data. No surprise there. Now, really, we just have to copy this one column. As I mentioned, we're not going to break it down by industry just yet. Okay. I'm going to put in a header row. Whoopsie. Oh, no, I got it. So we just need to do a sort to collect these together again. Yeah, we are going to do ascending because ultimately when we present this, we want it to look, we want to be, sort of honest about showing an expected progression of data, right? So assumedly the axis is going to be closer to 0 and the it's going to iterate up as we move along the x-axis or the y-axis. I'm probably going to be doing a column chart, so it'll be x. And we can do our counts here. And process. Oh. Okay, and now a second sort. Yeah, that's fine because actually we're going to be resorting this anyway. So we've got our counts. This data now is superfluous. We'll call this count. Now, of course, our salary here, it's not in order, so we're going to need to resort this again. The reason why we had to sort it by count before is so that we could get all the numbers together and then just erase the superfluous stuff. Oh, whoopsie. Hit the wrong key. Yeah, now we're sorting by salary, and we are ascending. There we go. Okay, so here it gets a little bit quirky. We could use a pie chart for this. We could, but that's not really the visualization is gonna be at odds because, okay, so for example, let's just look at that. Let's look at a pie of this. Now see, this is gonna look weird because it's gonna be percentage, but it's percentage of amount. So at a glance, you might think, wait, why is this, why are these all the same, but this is larger and these are numbers? It doesn't quite fit. It's possible, but it's a little weird to use a pie chart for salary brackets in this instance. It's not always, but if we're talking at a glance, there may be a bit of a conflict there. So what we might do is something like, as I mentioned, a column or a bar chart. We can still then preserve percentage because ultimately that's what we want, percentage of people and in these brackets. And we could use a pie chart for that. But as I mentioned, I see a little bit of a conflict between that visualization because it's a percentage of a number, Anywho, so let's look at a column chart for that. Don't have to do it, but it's certainly one way to go. In fact, it's even defaulting to a bar, which you can do. I mean, bar and columns are the same thing, just rotated. Okay. So we're starting to see this, but something quirky is already happening here, which is we don't have a percent listed, right? These aren't the percent. These are the actual counts. And that's not really what we want, is a count of the folks. We want a percent of this total. So unlike the pie chart, which does percentage automatically, that's not going to happen in the column chart. We're actually going to have to generate that. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to insert a column here and call it percent. And the reason why I inserted it between them rather than just adding it to the right is it'll allow me just to select the label, which is the salary bracket, and then the percent. That's what we really want, not the counts. We want the percent out of the total here. And let's just go ahead and get our total. I mean, you could add this by hand, but it's our count's 11, or excuse me, our total is 11. That means to get the percent, of course, all we have to do, and it's not technically going to be a percent, is a little bit of division. I'm just going to go this count of 40,000 to 49,000. So that would be cell C2 divided by the total, which is 11. And there, if I multiplied that, of course, I'd get the percentage. I'm not going to do that right now. I mean, you could, then we wouldn't have to tinker so much in the actual chart, but I want to show you sort of how this functions in the chart as well. So I'm just going to copy this cell and paste it here, and it's going to go ahead and automatically advance so that this cell we can see is talking about C3 divided by 11. This is C4 divided by 11. And all of these add up to 1. So now we can actually deal with percentages with our column chart. Charts column. Okay. So these are actually percentages. Okay, we have to do a couple of things. One thing, we don't really have a legend, so I'm going to get rid of that. Chart title, again, if you want it. We do want to label our axes, though. Sorry, Ariel. So our horizontal axis here, we have salary bracket. Much of this we don't really need. You can tinker with their appearance. We don't need slant labels because it's not long enough. If these labels were verbose, they'd tilt. Let's go ahead and change the axis to the vertical. And now this is percent of reported graduates. This isn't all of our graduates, of course. It's the ones who've reported. We do want to make that clear. We don't need the min and max because it's going to be built in as it's a percentage. We do want to change number format here. This maybe isn't self-evident. We want to change this to custom because it'll allow us to, here in the suffix blank, insert the percent symbol. And now you can see these look like percentages. They're not quite right because it's not 0.6%. The multiplication wasn't done. We didn't do that in the actual percent column on our sheet. We could have, but we don't really have to because we can change the scale here to 0.01 to hundredths, and then it actually fits. What it's actually doing is calling those numbers hundredths and then putting a percent after them. If that feels weird to you, you can simply just do the actual conversion here in the column, and then you don't have to do this. But otherwise, it's the result is the same. We've got 27% here, 0.9%, and so forth. You may want to do the conversion here in the actual sheet for if you're going to use this interactively, for the mouse over, because the data it presents will be slightly different. It'll be multiplied rather than converted here in the chart. Anyway, a couple other things. The major lines here, you'll notice it says grid lines and it gives you the number. There are no minor right now grid lines, and that's how I'm going to keep it. But this is a little bit odd. I understand why it did it because it goes up to 60 here, and that's sort of the upper limit is 54%. But going by 15s, that's just weird for us. I'm going to go ahead and change this number to, what would that be, 7? Yeah, and then it's going by 10s. I mean, the scale didn't change or anything. It's just we get a major line at every 10 rather than every 15, which is, we're not accustomed to seeing percentage lines at 15. It lets us know sort of at a glance, okay, well, this is 9-ish, right? Because it's right under the 10. And this is probably, what, 27-ish? Yeah. This is halfway between 50 and 60. It just tells you right at a glance in a format we're accustomed to. That's it. The last thing I might do is I'm going to change this to a deep green because we're talking about money here, just visually reinforcing the data we're looking at. So here, it's not a pie chart, even though we're dealing with percentage. We know that 27-ish% of the reported folks are in the 40 to 49 bracket. About 9 of them are in the 50 to 59K. Most of them are here in this 60 to 69. This again is fictitious data. And then the same amount, 9%, are in this 70 to 79. We've got none higher or lower. So again, if you were to print this, I would bring this data into Excel and handle it there because it's going to be able to print at much higher resolution. Otherwise, you can deal with it electronically or export to screen resolution just here in Google Sheets. So as I said, the one quirk about if you don't do the actual multiplication in the sheet, you'll notice that the data it's putting up there, see how it says 0.09. We could change that by doing the multiplication here itself. You'll notice that the bars got weird because, of course, we have to go in and change our scale since now it's 6,000%. The default is we'll correct that. It just takes the numbers as they are. Okay, so now when we oops, I thought I had that saved. Now when we look at our interactive chart, assuming it republished, no, it did not. Yeah, well, it will. Anywho, so there's that. Now, as I mentioned, we could, if we wanted, collate this data together into a stacked bar chart. We're just going to look at this very briefly. I mean, the gist of it is, let me just sort of pull over an example. What you'd have to do basically is just parse out your industries and the salaries and then get the counts for each salary bracket within each industry. I added NA for graduate education to demonstrate, since we're going to be seeing that with salary data, that no salary data was collected. Basically, you want to have it in a matrix where we've got the industries, and I broke it down by the industry that is most frequently reported, and then it descends from there. You can see the slope. So that's, we have most in graduate education, then business and marketing, then media and technology. And then the salary brackets here up across the different columns. Then we can do a stacked bar chart, which is much like a stacked column chart, much like a column chart, except it has a couple of variables. And in this case, we'll be looking at the industries and the salaries, and then that gets broken down here. I'm going to cancel this out. So it's basically just an additional step of sort of figuring out the percentages of, and these are all essentially percentages. So in this, for example, 12% of folks are at the 40 to 49K in business and marketing, 6% are at the 50 to 59 in business and marketing. So we're not talking about percentages in, each one of these is not 100%. These are percentages of the total. That's the way to set it up for a stacked bar chart. As I mentioned, this can be a little bit tricky to decrypt at a glance, right? We do need our legend over here. It tells us that the most commonly entered industry is graduate education. It's just over 30% of our reported folks. There's NA for the salary. Here, business and marketing, about 25-ish go into that. And we can see within that, the breakdown of how many folks, about 12, get 40 to 49, and then about 6 get 50 to 59 or 60 to 69. That's how that works. These are useful internally. I mean, they're more sophisticated documents. For accruement purposes, you may not want to use this just because you know, people are flustered. They want data at a glance. They don't want to sit here and try and decrypt what's happening. It's not like it's super complicated, but it's just an additional step. Something like, you know, this is very communicative immediately. Okay, so that's the gist of that. If you have any questions, as always, please feel free to contact me. Let me just pull up my URL, jtyrrell.com. All of my contact info is there. Feel free to shoot me some questions through email or something like that. All right. Later tutorials, we'll look at mapping some folks using the same data we collected through the form. And we'll also talk about mapping social networks. All right. I'll see you guys later.